This is the story of a man named Jeremy. Jeremy worked for a school in a big building where he was Teacher 186. Teacher 186's job was simple. He traveled from classroom to classroom, creating all of his curriculum and methods of assessment from scratch, writing and illustrating student resources that did not exist before, monitoring the progress of students attending both in person and remotely at the same time, tweaking said resources and class projects to meet his ever-changing students' needs, attending grade-level meetings, keeping clear and consistent communication with parents and guardians, recording logs of every single interaction with said parents and guardians, wiping down every classroom surface to disinfect everything during a pandemic. My word, that is not a simple job at all, is it? Teachers do quite a lot of work. What's that? There's more? You mean to tell me I'm not even halfway done with this list? What else is there? Differentiated instruction? What in blazes does that mean? I may be a celebrated voice actor, but that doesn't mean I talk in tongues. Welcome one and all to another new episode of Engage, where learning through play is the name of the game. I sincerely hope that you and yours are staying healthy and safe. Now, when 4/27 hits the calendar this year, it's going to mark an extra special occasion, the hotly anticipated release of the Ultra Deluxe edition of the Stanley Parable. Why 4/27, you ask? Simple, because Stanley is employee 427. And who exactly is Stanley? Well,
this is the story of a man named Stanley. Stanley worked for a company in a big building where he was employee number 427. Employee number 427's job was simple. He sat at his desk in room 427 and he pushed buttons on a keyboard. Orders came to him through a monitor on his desk, telling him what buttons to push, how long to push them, and in what order. This is what employee 427 did every day of every month of every year. And although others might have considered it soul-rending, Stanley relished every moment that the orders came in.
I know I would consider working an office job like that to be soul-rending, but if that's the case, why would I even want to play a game about it, let alone make a whole episode of this show about what looks to be just the cubicle life? Don't I have better things to do with my time? Well, ironically, that might just be one of the core takeaways of this whole experience, but I'm getting ahead of myself a little here. Join me as we continue our ongoing mission here on Engage to help make game-based learning of all different kinds more accessible to educators everywhere by opening a door to the Stanley Parable. Created as a mod of the much celebrated Half-Life 2 by putting Valve's popular Source engine to good use, the very first edition of the Stanley Parable stamped its time card back in 2011. Some would classify this game, rated at everyone 10 and up, as a walking simulator because, mechanically speaking, taking the protagonist for a walk from a first-person perspective is practically the only action you can take as the player. The sound of that simplicity might turn some people off, but sometimes, as the old saying goes, less is more. Out of all the video games we have discussed so far here on Engage, or come to think of it, really all of the different kinds of games we have explored here so far, the Stanley Parable is by and large the most accessible game of the bunch to leverage in your classroom, because having fewer game mechanics for the player to wrap their heads around means having a lower barrier to entry. This is great because it means you don't have to concern yourself much with your students' prior level of gaming literacy, nor do you have to preface the experience much with a tutorial on how to play the game itself. This is also great because using games with a lower barrier to entry often open up a wider door to creative possibilities on how you could leverage the game for learning, and I look forward to hearing your ideas in the comments below. And as of today, we have even more great news. Bringing the Stanley Parable into the classroom will be easier now than ever before thanks to the fact that the Ultra Deluxe Edition will bring the game to consoles. This is particularly helpful for any teachers who work in a school system where gaining access to Steam, let alone PCs, Macs, or Linux machines powerful enough to run such games, is unfortunately out of the question. Of course, it would be even better if the game was also coming out for iOS and Android. Knowing that iPads and Chromebooks tend to dominate what students have access to in most schools these days, but at least at the time of producing this episode, there do not appear to be plans in place to make it quite that easy for Stanley to be able to visit your school. So if you don't have access to Steam in your classroom, I personally recommend picking the game up for Nintendo Switch, because this system is definitely the easiest one to carry around and hook up to any sort of HD compatible display in your classroom. And the best part is you don't have to worry about having a strong internet connection in order to play this game. Heck, you don't even need an internet connection at all. Now that we've got the setup out of the way, let's dig into it. Why play the Stanley Parable in school? What learning opportunities does this game have to offer? At its core, the Stanley Parable was conceived of as an experiment in narrative design, which means the best way to experience all that it has to offer is to go in completely cold without reading anything about it or watching anything about it in advance, which of course makes it a challenge to discuss right here in this episode how you can leverage this game for learning. But what I'll tell you right off the bat, my teacher friends, is that no matter what path you decide to follow in the single player experience, you'll arrive at one of many different possible endings in about 10 minutes or so. That being said, consider this your spoiler warning. If you want to go in completely cold and play the game for yourself before we go on any further here, go ahead, hit pause on this video, play a couple rounds, and come on back. Just do me one favor and hit that subscribe button before you go. Along that same logic for getting the most out of this experience, you'll want to bring this game into your class completely unannounced ahead of time with as little preamble to set the stage as possible in order to maximize opportunity for students' discovery and interpretation. When you and your students play through the Stanley Parable together and reflect on the whole experience, you'll no doubt hear some thoughts from them that this is a game about choice. For example, once the player walks down the corridors of this seemingly ordinary office space, the player will eventually find themselves at a crossroads and they will have to make a decision. Should I walk through the door on my left, just as the narrator says that Stanley does in the story? Or do I take the door on the right because I'm curious about what might happen if I do that instead? And this is cool and all, but if your students have had experiences playing other games, they might jump in here with the excellent counterpoint of, so what? When I play other games, I need to make decisions all the time. What's so special about this particular game? And that's where things get really interesting. Because they're right. When we play other games, we're prompted quite frequently to make decisions all the time. Do I ask a non-playable character a question? Do I share some information? Or do I just make a snarky comment? Do I grab this power-up, or do I grab that power-up? Do I embark on an epic journey of pursuing a main questline? Or do I explore the world and hunt for side quests and other hidden secrets? What sets the Stanley Parable apart is that the story is a not-so-subtle allegory for the player. And while I believe in studying games as a literary medium in their own right, if you as a teacher have a need to pair a video game experience like this together with a more traditional form of text or media, the Stanley Parable makes a great companion for classic allegories such as George Orwell's Animal Farm or William Golding's Lord of the Flies. Broadly speaking, an allegory is a story in which a situation the characters find themselves in, or sometimes even the characters themselves and their distinctive qualities, represent abstract ideas or themes that the author wants their audience to think more deeply about. In the case of the Stanley Parable, if you and your students take a step back to think more deeply about the experience you just participated in when playing this game, you may come to realize that you, the player, are Stanley. The narrator clearly describes a character that is spending their time sitting at a computer pushing buttons and following orders, and if you play this game and do all the things that the narrator tells you that Stanley does, that's exactly what you've been doing this entire time. So congratulations, you've just won an elaborate game of Simon Says. But what if you didn't do everything the narrator told you to do? What if you tuned the narrator out and forged your own path? In interviews around the time of this game's original release, lead designer Davey Reedon has talked about how exploring that question inspired him to create this game. I mean, think about it for a minute. As much as people might get excited about the prospect of playing a new game that promises some sort of immersive interactive experience where you can play the way you want, inevitably, all narrative-driven games find some kind of way to gently nudge the player along toward following a critical path in order to progress the main storyline.
Hey!
Maybe you're given that gentle nudge forward by a direct interaction with a non-playable character, or just listening to whatever they have to say in a cutscene or voiceover. Maybe you're guided through a process of making careful observations about what lies ahead, or sometimes even by literally tracing the steps that get you to the next pivotal event. And Reedon could not help but ask that big what-if question: what if the player doesn't listen to any of those directions? What would happen in the game then? What could happen? This is what makes storytelling in games so fascinating, and why I believe that games are worth studying in schools in their own right. In a 2011 interview with Kotaku, Reedon highlighted, there is a space between the developer's intentions and what the player actually does. So the player has to fill that gap in themselves. No other medium is capable of that. And it's true. Whenever we read a book or listen to a song or check out a TV show or movie or take in a play in the theater, we don't usually get to have a say in however the story turns out. Everything is already written on the page or performed however the artist or the actor intended. So that's that. But when we play games, we do get to have a say. Or do we? Looking back at the Stanley Parable, while there will often be clearly displayed forks in the road, there are also a ton of other decision points throughout the experience that the player can only find through experimentation. This taps into our innate desire for agency, or the feeling of having genuine impact on how the story turns out, which, if you think about it, is not so different from real life, because we sure want to feel like our choices matter. So curiosity might get the better of you in the Stanley Parable. Maybe you'll try venturing down the road less traveled. Maybe you'll simply act out of defiance because you don't like being told what to do all the time. Or maybe you'll try and break the game, so to speak, by attempting to go places you're thinking the game doesn't want you to go. But much like a classic choose-your-own-adventure book, you will discover that every path you could possibly conceive of taking does in fact branch out and eventually lead to its own scripted ending. Heck, even if you decide to stay put in a broom closet, thinking that if you do nothing, surely the game will do nothing, you'd be wrong. To quote from a certain radio hit by the legendary progressive rock band Rush, you could choose not to decide and still have made a choice. But can I choose free will? If you and your students have the time to play through every alternate route you could possibly conceive of taking, you will discover that no matter what you end up doing, the narrator will always be there to comment on your decision. So, what does that say about this experience? Overall, there is truly a wealth of possibility with the Stanley Parable to connect to all sorts of abstract concepts that would most likely be found in the fabric of an English language arts, social studies, or advisory curriculum, such as studying allegory, symbolism, and metaphor, thinking deeply about decision-making processes and how we respond to authority figures like the narrator, or even getting into exploring how certain religions or other systems of belief have wrestled with the debate over all of human history about whether we as humans have free will or whether our lives are lived according to the predetermined whims of fate. After all, what does it mean to be free? If you play the original Stanley Parable and follow the path the narrator spells out for you to take, you'll eventually arrive at what is known as the freedom ending, where Stanley finally emerges from the office building and gets to take a breath of fresh air outside. But is Stanley truly free? We never actually get to hear from Stanley himself throughout the entire experience, so should we take the narrator's word for it when he tells us Stanley is free? And does any of this, as the player, align with whatever your definition of freedom is? To go meta even further on this, when I have taught English language arts in the past, not only have I asked my students to think very deeply about the intention the author has behind telling their story, but also to think very deeply about why the author of a story chose the format they chose in order to tell that story. And in that regard, after having your students play through the Stanley Parable, ask them to reflect on why they think Davy Reedon decided to tell this story through the medium of games. This exercise could easily be incorporated into any curricula focusing on a creative decision-making process, be it creative writing, art, design, or perhaps even explaining the rationale behind the setup for a brand new science experiment. Speaking from my own experience with teaching writing, this line of inquiry or this exercise is most helpful with helping students who feel frustrated with trying to get their train of thought to reach some sort of conclusion. And maybe the best strategy is just to pose some sort of what-if question, just to generate some sort of hypothetical outcomes for how a story might pan out or how a speech will wrap up. And maybe whatever you come up with veers well off the course from whatever that pesky narrator says that's living in your head. It was in that moment that Jeremy planned to thank his audience for watching this episode of Engage, where learning through play is the name of the game. He considered encouraging anyone interested in supporting production of this fine educational program to join his Patreon at patreon.com/engageshow. But what if he decided not to do that? What if he decided instead to stand up, step out of frame, and let the camera continue rolling? Perhaps his audience would stick around to see if there was some sort of post-credits scene. You know, like they do in the movies sometimes. You do wait until the very end of a movie to see if there is a post-credits scene, right? Of course you do, just like you clicked on the subscribe and promised to share this episode with exactly 427 of your closest friends. Okay, that's a wrap. But wait, surely there is more.